Unmasking Fear. The Journey of a Confident Woman. Hook. Ever felt trapped in a nightmare where the darkness follows you everywhere? What if the scariest thing you have to face is yourself? Stay with us as we dive deep into a mind-bending journey where fear isn't just a force you fight, it's something you become. Don't look away, because the shocking truth is just around the corner. Keep watching to see what happens next. The night was heavy. Dark clouds swallowed the moon. Rain beat relentlessly against the windows. Inside the house, a single light flickered. Emma stared at the flickering bulb, her pulse quickening. The silence of the room was deafening. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. Her breath shallow. She could feel it. Someone was watching. Her skin prickled, her body tense. Her instinct screamed, but she didn't move. The air grew thick, suffocating. Her eyes darted to the door. She heard a soft shuffle. The floor creaked, slow and deliberate. A shadow shifted outside the door. Emma's heart raced. She leaned forward, straining to hear more. Another shuffle, then a soft tap. Just one. The sound was too faint to be real, but it was real. Emma stood, slowly, her legs unsteady. Her gaze locked onto the door. Another tap. Closer this time. The room felt colder. Her hand reached for the doorknob, but her body refused to move. Every instinct told her to run, but she wouldn't. Not now. She'd made it this far, and she wouldn't let fear control her. The door opened slowly, the hinge groaning. The hallway was empty. She stepped forward, eyes scanning the shadows. The house seemed too still, too quiet. Each step felt heavier than the last. The air grew thick again, and then a sharp whisper. Emma. It came from the darkness, cold, eerie, almost inhuman. Her breath caught in her throat. She spun around, but there was nothing. No one. Just the empty, suffocating space. The whisper returned, this time louder. Emma? She was alone. Wasn't she? Something moved behind her. She turned quickly. Nothing. Yet the feeling remained, like invisible eyes were watching. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tremble. Her hands were shaking now. Something was coming. She could feel it. And she wasn't ready. But she had no choice. She had to face it. The air thickened even more, suffocating her. She tried to steady her breath, but it was impossible. Every nerve in her body screamed. The whisper came again. Emma, closer this time. Too close. She spun around once more. Nothing. Only the endless darkness of the hallway. Her heartbeat pounded in her chest. Her body screamed to flee, but her feet wouldn't move. They were rooted to the spot. A chill ran down her spine. She couldn't see anything, yet she knew. She knew something was there. Something not human. Her pulse was in her throat now. Tight. Unbearable. The whisper came again. A laugh, low and cold. Don't be scared, Emma. She froze. The voice was familiar, but twisted. Her mind raced. Her stomach churned. Who are you? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Silence. Then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It was her, or it looked like her. A perfect reflection, yet wrong. Her eyes widened. Her breath caught. The figure smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was cold, empty. Emma stepped back, heart hammering. The reflection took a step forward. Another. Closer. Closer still. A cold laugh echoed through the empty hallway. You can't escape me, Emma, it said, its voice low and mocking. Her skin crawled. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were frozen. The figure reached out. Its hand brushed against her cheek, frozen like ice. Emma flinched, her body recoiling, but it didn't stop. The reflection grinned wider, a dark joy in its eyes. I've been waiting for this moment. Emma's mind raced, but her body refused to move. The figure's hand tightened around her wrist. "Let go," Emma shouted, trying to yank free. But the grip was unyielding. The figure's smile stretched further. It leaned in close. "Face the truth, Emma." The whisper returned, louder now. "Face your fears." And with that, the grip tightened. Her heart pounded. The air crackled with tension. And then, everything went dark. The darkness was thick, suffocating. Emma's mind screamed, but her voice wouldn't come. She couldn't breathe. Her lungs burned for air. Her body felt weightless, yet trapped. She tried to move, but couldn't. She felt bound. Something cold pressed against her skin. She opened her eyes, but the darkness remained. Where was she? Where had the hallway gone? The figure, was it still there? Her heart thudded in her chest. The whispering returned, barely audible at first. Then louder, closer. "Emma?" Her eyes darted wildly. She could feel the presence again, like a shadow lurking, just beyond reach. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, dark and suffocating. The cold intensified. Her fingers twitched. Her body finally moved, just enough to sit up. But the air was thicker now, harder to move through. She gasped, her breath shallow and frantic. The voice returned, now a low growl. "You can't run from me forever." Emma's skin prickled. The coldness pressed in tighter. She clenched her fists, trying to summon strength. "You're not real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not real." The voice laughed, sharp, cruel. It echoed around her, coming from every direction. "Look around, Emma." She blinked, the darkness swirling around her. A faint glow appeared. It wasn't much, but enough to make her see. Shapes. Shifting shadows. The walls felt wrong, warped like a dream. And then she saw it. The reflection. The same twisted figure, standing just ahead. It was staring at her, eyes gleaming with malice. Its smile spread wide again. Emma's chest tightened. The figure stepped forward, impossibly close. "You thought you could hide from me, Emma." The air was so thick now it felt like a physical weight. "It's time to face your fears." She tried to back away, but the space was closing in on her. She was trapped. The figure reached for her, slow and deliberate. She could hear her own breath echo in her ears. Every instinct screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure's hand hovered just in front of her face. "Let me show you the truth," it whispered. It touched her cheek, cold like ice. Emma shuddered. The world around her spun. Everything was collapsing. And then it all went silent. The silence was unbearable, like the world had frozen. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps. Her chest heaved, but no sound escaped. Everything felt off. The coldness had vanished, but something worse lingered. Something darker. The shadows seemed to stretch and contract, pulsating. She was no longer in the hallway. The walls around her were different. Twisted, like they were breathing. Emma's heart hammered in her chest. Her eyes darted around, trying to find something, anything, familiar. But all she saw was a dark, endless void. She stood up, her legs trembling. A strange pull gripped her stomach. Someone was watching. She could feel it. The air was thick again, heavy with pressure. The whisper returned. "Emma," it was everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. She turned, desperate to locate the source. But there was nothing. No figure, no shadow. Only the oppressive silence. And the voice. Closer now. "Emma." She spun around again. A flash of movement. There. A silhouette. Just at the edge of her vision. She couldn't make it out, but she felt it. Her pulse raced. Her hands trembled. The silhouette stepped forward. Closer. Closer still. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. It just kept coming. Closer and closer. It was like it was made of the shadows, shifting with each step. The floor beneath her seemed to tremble with its movements. Her skin crawled. Something wasn't right. She should have run. She should have fought. But her feet were frozen. The figure stopped just in front of her. And then it smiled. Not the twisted grin from before. A calm, unnerving smile. "Are you ready, Emma?" The voice was hers, but not hers. It echoed in her mind, cold and distorted. She wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything. But the figure's eyes locked onto hers, and she was paralyzed. The room seemed to darken even further. A deep, empty void. Nothing. And then, with a breathless, sharp inhale, the world shattered, the world fractured. Cracks split the dark like lightning, tearing through the silence. Emma's heart slammed in her chest. The ground beneath her feet cracked open. Her body lurched forward, but she couldn't move fast enough. She was falling through the blackness. Her breath caught, suffocating. The air rushed past her like wind, but it was cold, sharp. Her skin stung with every passing second. Everything spun. Everything blurred. Then, just as suddenly, the fall stopped. Her body slammed into something cold, hard. Her chest heaved. She gasped for air, disoriented. The ground beneath her was rough, like stone. She forced her eyes open. She was on the floor, but this wasn't the house. It wasn't anything she recognized. The room was vast, dark, endless. The walls were smooth, curved, too perfect. She pushed herself up, trembling. The air was so still, so silent. It was suffocating. The whisper came again. That voice, her voice. "Emma." She spun, eyes wide, looking for the source. Nothing. Her mind was spinning, confused. What was this place? What was happening? The ground shifted beneath her feet, a low hum vibrating through the stone. Something stirred in the distance. A dark shape, moving toward her, slowly, methodically. Her pulse quickened. She backed away, her breath shallow. The shape grew closer, and then she saw it. The reflection. It was her again, standing in the shadows, but not like before. The figure was wrong. The edges of its body rippled and twisted, like smoke in the wind. It grinned. "Still trying to escape," it whispered, its voice hollow mocking. Emma's chest tightened. She couldn't move. Her legs were heavy. Her hands trembled. The figure's smile deepened. "You can't outrun me, Emma." It took a step forward, and then another, closer. Each step seemed to drain the light from the room. The walls seemed to close in. Her head spun. "You're part of me," it said, its voice now a low growl. "You've always been." The air was thick with dread. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and Emma finally understood. There was no escape. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't an illusion. It was her. All of her darkest fears, her doubts, her regrets, everything she had tried to bury, everything she had tried to run from. The figure stretched out its hand. "Accept me," it whispered. Emma wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but she was frozen. The figure's hand was inches from her face now, and with a deep, chilling breath, she whispered, "No." The figure's eyes darkened. It smirked. And then everything went black. The darkness pressed in, suffocating. Emma couldn't feel anything. No ground beneath her. No air around her. Nothing. Just black. Pure black. Her heart raced in the stillness. The quiet was maddening. But then a shift. A whisper. It was faint at first. "Emma." The voice was different now. Gentler. Familiar. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't the reflection. "Emma." She tried to open her eyes. She tried to move, but her body was frozen. The voice was closer now, calming. "Wake up. Wake up." The words cut through the darkness. sharper than any scream. She had to wake up. She had to. But how? Wake up, Emma. Her chest heaved as she struggled to respond, but her throat felt tight. The blackness around her rippled like water. Suddenly, she could feel it, something tugging at her, pulling her. Her limbs were no longer heavy. Her breath rushed back into her lungs. The pull grew stronger, and then, with a jolt, she was snapped from the void. The air rushed into her lungs, sharp and cold. She gasped, coughing. Her eyes shot open. She was back in the room. The dim light flickered above her, casting strange shadows on the walls. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up, looking around. It was the same house, the same familiar room, but everything felt different. The air was thick with tension, like something had shifted. Her mind was racing, still struggling to comprehend what had just happened. What was real? Her skin crawled. The whispers, had they been real? She looked around the room, her breath still shallow. The walls felt closer now. The shadows seemed darker, but there was no figure, no reflection, only silence. She stood slowly, her knees weak beneath her. Something wasn't right. Her eyes darted to the door. She should leave. She should get out of here. But her feet wouldn't move. Something held her in place. Her gaze turned back to the mirror. The reflection, her reflection, stared back at her. And for a moment, Emma thought she saw it. A faint smile. Twisted and cruel. Then it was gone. Just like that. A chill ran down her spine. But she was no longer sure if it was fear or something worse. Her pulse quickened. The door. She had to leave. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Not anymore. The room seemed to close in on her, and in the silence, her own voice echoed in her head. Run, Emma. But where could she run to? Her breath caught in her throat. The walls felt closer now, pressing in on her, suffocating. She turned toward the door, her legs shaking, her mind racing. But the door wasn't there. It should have been. It was supposed to be there. Instead, there was nothing. Just a smooth, featureless wall. Her heart pounded, a thunderous rhythm in her chest. She stumbled back, eyes wide, searching the space around her. How? She whispered to herself. The silence mocked her. The whispers returned. Emma. The voice was soft, like a breath against her ear. Her head spun. No, this wasn't happening again. She reached out, her hand trembling, touching the cold, smooth wall. Nothing. Her hand slid down, her fingertips tracing the surface, desperate. There was no door, no exit, no way out. Her pulse raced as panic clawed at her chest. The air grew colder, thick with dread. And then she saw it. The floor beneath her feet, shifting, warping. The edges of the room began to distort, bending like glass under pressure. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the room kept changing, twisting into something worse. The shadows around her deepened, pulsing, alive. Emma. The voice was clearer now, sharper, closer. She whirled around, but there was no one. Nothing. She was alone. But the weight of the presence was crushing her. The darkness was suffocating. Her eyes darted from corner to corner, seeking a way out. But all she could see were the shadows, stretching longer, moving closer. The walls, they were breathing. Her chest tightened. Emma. It came again, closer, as if the voice was inside her head now. No, this wasn't happening. Her hands clenched into fists, nails biting into her palms. She forced herself to take a step forward. One step, then another. The floor groaned beneath her feet. Her gaze fixed on the mirror at the far side of the room. It was reflecting her, but different. The reflection was distorted, like a twisted version of herself, its eyes wide with terror, staring back at her. The smile was there again, that cold, empty smile. "Don't you see, Emma?" the reflection whispered. "It's always been you." Her legs buckled, and she fell to the ground, gasping for air. The reflection stepped forward, and the room seemed to collapse around her. The walls squeezed in, the shadows stretching and reaching. Her mind spiraled into chaos. And then, just as it all seemed to close in, there was a voice again. Not the reflection, not the whispers, a different voice. "Emma, wake up." Her eyes snapped open. She gasped, and the room was gone. The darkness was gone, and for the first time, she felt free. But something still lingered in the air. The echo of her own voice. The whisper of the darkness. Her hand trembled as she reached for the light switch. The room was silent. The door was back, and she could leave. But before she reached for the handle, something held her back. The reflection in the mirror was still there, waiting, staring. And for a moment, Emma wasn't sure if she was free at all. Emma stood frozen, her fingers just inches from the door handle. Her heart pounded in her chest. The reflection in the mirror was too still, too calm. It was watching her, its eyes dark and hollow. Her breath caught in her throat. The silence in the room pressed against her, suffocating. Something was wrong. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her feet refused to move. The reflection, it wasn't just a mirror anymore. It was a part of her, a twisted part she couldn't escape. She took a shaky step back, eyes locked on the figure in the glass. It smiled again, not the twisted, mocking grin from before. This time it was something else, a knowing smile, one that held no kindness, one that held everything she had buried. "Why are you running, Emma?" the reflection asked, its voice cold and smooth, like ice scraping against stone. Emma's breath hitched. She could feel it, the truth of the words. Her pulse raced as memories flashed in front of her eyes. All the things she had hidden, all the fears she had ignored, all the mistakes. The reflection knew them all. It knew her. She stepped back again, her body trembling. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're not real." But the reflection didn't flinch. It just kept smiling. "You're lying to yourself," it said softly. "You always have." The room seemed to close in on her. The shadows stretched longer, creeping toward her. The air grew heavier, pressing down, suffocating her. Emma could feel the weight of every word, every mistake she had ever made, closing in on her. Her chest tightened. "Stop!" she gasped, clutching at her throat. But the reflection didn't stop. It stepped forward, its feet not even touching the ground. Closer, closer still. "You're afraid of me, Emma," it whispered, its voice wrapping around her like a vice. "You're afraid of the truth." The room was spinning now. Her head was spinning. The reflection's smile widened. "Everything you've tried to escape, it's all inside you." Emma's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The reflection was standing above her now. The smile stretched wider, more predatory. Her mind was collapsing, the walls closing in. "Face it, Emma." Her hands shook uncontrollably, and in that moment she knew she couldn't run from it. Not anymore. The reflection reached out, and its hand, cold as ice, brushed against her cheek. "Accept it," it murmured, its voice barely a whisper. Emma's breath hitched, her vision blurred, and then she closed her eyes. But the moment she did, she felt something shift. Something cracked. The silence in the room broke. A loud, deafening crack echoed through her mind. The reflection shrieked, its face twisting in agony. And then it was gone. The room was still again. The mirror was empty. Emma gasped, sitting up, her eyes wide, her hands shaking. Her heart raced. She blinked, her vision clearing. It was over. The reflection was gone. She was alone. But as she stood, one last chilling thought crossed her mind. The door was still closed. The room was still a prison, and in the silence, she heard one last whisper. "You're never truly alone, Emma." And the darkness was waiting to Emma's chest heaved as she stood in the still room. The mirror was empty. The reflection was gone, but a cold sense of dread lingered in the air, wrapping around her like a vice. She had thought it was over. She had convinced herself that the nightmare had ended. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The silence pressed against her, thick and heavy. Her fingers brushed against the cold surface of the mirror, still expecting it to shift, to show something else. But there was only glass. Her breath was shallow, her mind racing. She should leave. She should run. But the door was still sealed shut. The walls felt as if they were closing in again, shrinking, tightening around her. She turned, eyes darting around the room. But there was no exit, no way out. "You're never truly alone, Emma." The voice was softer now, distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't in her head. It came from somewhere behind her. Her pulse quickened as she whipped around, her eyes searching the shadows. Nothing, just the empty room. The same room she had woken up in. Her body trembled, her knees weak beneath her. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice breaking. No answer, but she could feel it, the presence, watching, waiting. Her heart slammed in her chest as she turned back to the mirror. Her reflection was there again. This time it wasn't smiling. It wasn't mocking. It was blank, empty. A hollow version of herself, staring back at her with lifeless eyes. A shiver ran down her spine. She reached forward, her fingers trembling as they hovered near the surface of the mirror. Then, slowly, her reflection raised a hand. It mirrored her every movement. But this time, it wasn't her. The reflection's eyes grew darker, deeper, and a voice whispered from it, cold and final. "You can never escape me, Emma." Before she could pull her hand away, the glass cracked. A sharp, terrifying sound. And something reached through. It grabbed her wrist. Cold fingers, ice cold, tightening around her. Emma screamed, struggling to free herself. But it was no use. The reflection pulled her in. The room dissolved around her. And everything went dark that Emma's vision blurred as the cold fingers tightened around her wrist. The glass cracked more, splintering like fragile ice. She tried to pull away, panic rising in her chest, but it was no use. The force from the mirror was too strong. Her breath came in frantic gasps, her mind spinning. The cold seeped deeper into her skin, into her bones. Her hand, her real hand, felt numb, unable to move. But there was a shift, a pull. It wasn't just the reflection anymore. It was something else, something old, something deep inside her. The weight of it pressed against her chest, suffocating. Her head spun, her breath shallow. The world around her began to distort, bending and stretching like it was unraveling. But she didn't fight. She couldn't. Her eyes flickered toward the mirror one last time. The reflection stared back, unblinking, its expression empty. It wasn't mocking now. It wasn't smiling. It was waiting. A piece of her, the piece she had tried to outrun, tried to bury, was staring back at her, quiet and still. And then, for the first time, Emma understood. It was never the mirror that held her. It was her. She had been trapped within herself all along. Her fears, her regrets, her failures, all of it had built up, forming the reflection that haunted her. The presence, the darkness. It had all been a part of her, waiting to be acknowledged. And in that moment, Emma realized that escape wasn't about running. It was about facing what was inside. With a deep, shuddering breath, Emma let go. The grip on her wrist loosened. The mirror shattered in front of her, the pieces falling like glass rain. The weight in her chest lifted. The room around her began to fade, the shadows dissipating like smoke. The air was lighter now, less suffocating. She closed her eyes, feeling the last of the tension slip away. When she opened them again, she was standing in a different place. The walls were gone. The mirror was gone. She was free, not from the room, but from herself. And as the final shards of darkness melted away, Emma stepped forward, no longer afraid to face the world outside.